So let's do a little housekeeping first. First thing we want to talk about before diving into Revit rendering is what you should already know. Before going into the topics of this class, we're assuming that you know a little bit about Revit. What you should know already is a little bit of the modeling basics. Definitely be familiar with walls, doors, windows, roofs, and other basic modeling objects. Should have worked with these objects before, put them together, worked in various views to create basic modeling components. You don't have to be an expert on every aspect of every object, but you should be fairly comfortable with them. Project browser, very important part of working with Revit. And I'm going to assume that you've been in the project browser before, that you're comfortable finding views and creating certain kind of views. Certainly plans, sections, and elevations should be familiar to you. In this class, we'll be creating 3D views as well. So moving around the project browser and understanding how the views relate to one another is an important prerequisite skill. And probably most important of all is the Revit project structure. You should understand that in most cases, Revit files are set up as either a single file or a small handful of files that contain multiple views. What you do in your view affects others. So if you move objects, delete objects, change objects, it's not a disconnected separate drawing that you're working in. You're working in a view in a larger project structure. So be aware that if you're working in a team with other members, changes you make are going to affect those other members, and that's important. So as we get into Revit rendering, you may be tempted to make changes that affect the rendering and make the rendering look nicer, but it might actually affect the work that other folks are doing in other disciplines. So just be aware of that. So those are the prerequisites that I'm assuming that you know. Let's look at an overview of the rendering process. So typically we're going to start with a view. Now in Revit, you have to render from a 3D view, so that can include either an axonometric or a perspective view. So we can either use an existing one that's already in your project, or we can create one specifically for the purposes of rendering. The next step is usually to refine your model. Your model obviously includes all the geometry that we'll actually be rendering. This is the walls, the doors, the windows, the roofs, and any other components that we might add. And typically one of the most important aspects that we're concerned with our model with respect to rendering is the materials that are applied to those objects. So is it made out of brick? Is it made out of tile, concrete, and so on? And those characteristics will be used in the rendering. Next, we consider lighting. We have both artificial and natural lighting in Revit. Artificial lights are just component families that we add to our models that have lighting characteristics. They can even be as accurate as simulating actual true-to-life light fixtures. And we have natural light, which simulates the sun and its actual position in the sky for our geographic location and the time and date of the year. And finally, how do we want to output our rendering? So we can output our rendering to the screen, or we can output it to print. We want to consider those factors when we decide settings we want to use when generating our rendering. Also, we can consider, do we want a photorealistic rendering? Do we want more of an illustration kind of feel? So those are characteristics that we can incorporate into our process as well. So in general, this is the flow that we'll follow as we move through the rendering process in your projects, and this is the flow that we'll follow here in the course. It's not to say that you won't do this in a little bit more organic way. Certainly you might be working on the models and the materials, and then something will occur to you about lighting, or you might want to tweak and adjust the view, and then that might trigger a change in the lighting or a change in the output settings. So you'll certainly do a little bit of back and forth, but in general, this is the flow that you'll typically follow.